The wind howled through the empty streets of the Hamptons, carrying with it the bitter chill of winter and the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Inside a dimly lit house, Fernanda stared at the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered, "How did we lose everything?" Behind her, William paced the creaking wooden floor, his fists clenched at his sides. The flickering light from the fireplace cast jagged shadows on the walls, mirroring the cracks that had begun to form in their once perfect life. A single ornament lay shattered on the floor, a glimmer of their former grandeur, now reduced to fragments. As the silence grew heavier, broken only by the distant crash of waves, a question lingered in the air: was this the end of their story, or the beginning of something they never expected? Fernanda stood by the grand bay window of their penthouse, staring out at the city skyline bathed in golden hues from the setting sun. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the marble countertop behind her. Notifications flooded her screen, comments, messages, tags. At first, she assumed it was another viral post celebrating their latest extravagant getaway. Just days ago, she and William had returned from a lavish retreat in the Maldives, flooding social media with pictures of infinity pools, champagne toasts, and designer outfits. But as she glanced at the phone, her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "Fernanda, have you seen this?" William's voice boomed from the adjacent room, carrying an edge she rarely heard. He appeared moments later, holding a tablet, his face pale and drawn. He tapped on the screen with urgency, thrusting it toward her. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her crystal glass of wine. The headline blared across the screen: "Billion-dollar Ponzi scheme unveiled, investors devastated." Beneath it, the name of the firm William had trusted for years jumped out like a slap. Her breath caught. This isn't real," she stammered, clutching the tablet. "This can't be real." William ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture she recognized as pure panic. "I've been trying to get through to Paul, but he's not answering. The office is shut down. Phone's disconnected. It's everywhere, Fernanda. Our money, it's gone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on them. Fernanda's mind raced. The firm had been the cornerstone of their wealth, their luxurious homes, exotic vacations, charity galas, and the carefully curated image they projected to millions of followers online. As the realization sank in, the buzz of her phone became unbearable. She picked it up, her thumb hesitating over the notifications. The comments were no longer adoring or envious. Instead, they were scathing. "Is this why they've been so quiet lately? Another fake fairy tale exposed. Should have seen this coming. Easy money never lasts." Her chest tightened as she scrolled, each comment like a dagger. "We need to figure this out," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "There has to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks." William slumped onto the pristine white sofa, his head in his hands. "I don't think you understand, Fernanda. It's over. Everything. The accounts are frozen. The properties, we'll have to sell them just to cover the debts. And the taxes." Fernanda's head spun. "No," she said defiantly, pacing the room. "We can fix this. We've fixed worse. We've always bounced back." But William didn't respond. The silence between them was deafening. Over the next few days, the nightmare unfolded in brutal detail. Lawyers and financial advisors confirmed the worst. Every asset, every security they thought was solid, had been tied to the fraudulent scheme. By the time the dust settled, they were left with little more than the clothes in their walk-in closets and the small vacation property they had purchased in the Hamptons, a quaint house, meant more for rustic charm than luxury. Moving day came faster than expected. The grandiose penthouse that had been their sanctuary was stripped of its opulence, the designer furniture auctioned off, the walls bare. Fernanda stood in the living room one last time, watching movers carry away the remnants of a life she had so carefully crafted. She had loved this space, not just for its extravagance, but for what it represented: success, adoration, a life envied by many. William leaned against the doorframe, looking exhausted. "The car's here," he said quietly. Fernanda nodded, taking one final glance around before following him out. The elevator ride down was silent, the weight of their new reality sinking in with each floor they passed. The drive to the Hamptons felt endless. Snow flurries began to fall, dusting the roads in white. Fernanda stared out the window, the city skyline disappearing behind them. She thought about their followers, the people who had adored them. She thought about the charity galas where they had been photographed as the golden couple, the countless moments they had broadcast to the world as proof of their perfection. And now, all of it was gone. When they arrived at the small house, it looked even smaller than Fernanda remembered. The wooden fence was crooked, the paint on the shutters chipped. It was a far cry from the polished mansions they were used to, but it was theirs. For now, William unloaded the last of their belongings from the car, carrying the suitcases up the icy steps. Fernanda lingered on the porch, the chill of the winter air biting through her coat. The quiet was unsettling. No honking taxis, no flashing cameras, no murmurs of admiration. Just the sound of the wind and the faint crashing of waves in the distance. As she stepped inside, the cold seemed to follow her. The house was sparsely furnished, the air musty from months of neglect. Fernanda looked around, trying to summon some spark of optimism, but the overwhelming sense of loss drowned out any hope. William dropped the bags by the staircase and sank into a worn armchair. "This is it," he said, his voice hollow. Fernanda didn't respond. She walked over to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the frosted glass. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a deceptive softness. It should have been beautiful, but all she felt was emptiness. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The snow had settled thickly around the small house in the Hamptons, muffling the world in an eerie stillness. Inside, the quiet was no less suffocating. Fernanda stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the half-unpacked boxes piled on the counter. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and cold stone, a far cry from the floral diffusers and curated aromas that had once perfumed their penthouse. She tightened her scarf, even indoors, as the heating sputtered weakly in the corner. From the living room, she could hear William pacing. His footsteps were uneven, stopping now and then before starting again. This pattern had been going on for hours, the rhythm of his restlessness invading every corner of the house. "I called the lawyer again," he said, his voice cutting through the silence as he stepped into the kitchen. He leaned against the doorframe, his face drawn and weary. The sharp lines of his jaw looked harsher under the dim light, the tension in his shoulders betraying how deeply this fall had affected him. "No updates. The accounts are still frozen, and the buyers for the penthouse are trying to lowball us." Fernanda didn't respond immediately. She picked up a cup from one of the boxes and placed it in the cabinet, moving slowly, as though every action required effort. "Did you hear me?" he asked, his tone edging toward irritation. "Yes, William, I heard you," she snapped, turning to face him. "But what do you expect me to say? We've lost everything. Do you want me to magically fix this?" His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked away, staring at the window where frost had crept along the edges of the glass. "Of course not," he muttered after a pause. I don't know. I'm trying." "Trying?" she said, her voice rising. "Trying to do what?" "We're stuck here, in this shack, waiting for the world to stop looking at us like we're some kind of spectacle. Our friends," she stopped, laughing bitterly. "No, wait. Not friends. Followers. Because that's all they were, weren't they? They've all disappeared." William's jaw tightened. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I wanted this?" "No, but you trusted him," she shot back. "You trusted Paul, even when I told you something felt off about those meetings." "But no, William always knows best, doesn't he?" The accusation landed hard, and for a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the struggling heater. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "A mistake, Fernanda. And now I'm here, trying to fix it, while you—" He stopped himself, shaking his head as if to dispel whatever he had been about to say. "While I what?" she pressed. "Nothing," he muttered, turning away and heading back to the living room. Fernanda exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, and she hated it. She hated how powerless she felt, how everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The pristine image she had spent years cultivating was shattered, and with it, her sense of control. She glanced at her phone on the counter, still lit up with notifications she had no intention of reading. She had stopped opening social media entirely. Every time she did, the flood of comments and speculation was unbearable. Some posts were cruel, mocking their downfall, while others expressed a pity that felt even worse. As the evening wore on, the tension in the house grew thicker. They avoided each other, retreating to separate corners as though the distance might dull the sharp edges of their arguments. Fernanda sat by the window in the small living room, wrapped in a blanket as she stared at the snow falling outside. The world looked so peaceful, so deceptively serene. She thought of the holiday seasons they used to have, the glittering parties, the endless flow of champagne, the gifts wrapped in expensive paper stacked under a towering Christmas tree. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, another life entirely. William, meanwhile, was on the phone again, pacing as he spoke in low, clipped tones. He was trying to salvage something, anything, but each call seemed to end the same way, with frustration and defeat. By the time he hung up, the room had grown dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fireplace. He dropped into a chair across from Fernanda, rubbing his temples. "What now?" she asked, her tone softer this time. He looked at her, the anger from earlier replaced by exhaustion. "We wait," he said simply. "We sell what we can, we pay off the debts, and we figure out what's next." Fernanda sighed, leaning her head back against the armchair. "What's next?" she echoed, her voice laced with doubt. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The quiet between them was heavy, but it wasn't angry. It was something else, something emptier. The days that followed blurred together in a monotony of cold mornings and long silences. Fernanda spent her time trying to make the house feel like home, unpacking what little they had brought with them. She arranged the furniture, cleaned the dusty shelves, and hung a few pictures on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was something to focus on. William, on the other hand, threw himself into emails and phone calls, chasing any lead that might offer them a way out. But as each day passed without progress, the strain on him became more apparent. One evening, Fernanda found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his laptop. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and his hair disheveled, a stark contrast to the polished man she was used to seeing. She placed a mug of tea in front of him, sitting down across the table. "You should take a break," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. "I can't afford to take a break." "You can't afford to burn out either," she replied, her voice soft but firm. For the first time in days, he looked at her, really looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "We'll figure it out," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. He didn't pull away, and for a moment, they sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, the snow continuing to fall outside. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days in the Hamptons stretched into weeks, each one colder and quieter than the last. Snow blanketed the ground outside, softening the already muted world, while the sea crashed in the distance, its relentless rhythm a stark contrast to the stillness in the house. The air inside felt heavy, as though the weight of everything they had lost was woven into the very fabric of the walls. Fernanda sat on the worn couch, absently running her fingers along the edge of the wool blanket draped over her lap. She watched as the fire in the small stone fireplace flickered and crackled, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the room. On the coffee table before her lay an open magazine, one of the few remnants of their former life, but the glossy pages filled with designer advertisements and luxurious vacation spreads felt like relics from a world she no longer belonged to. William was upstairs, his muffled voice drifting down as he paced and made yet another phone call. He had taken to spending hours in the cramped study, poring over documents, spreadsheets, and legal statements. Fernanda wasn't sure if he was working toward a solution or simply clinging to the illusion of control, but she didn't ask. She hadn't dared to, not after their last argument. The silence between them had become something different, no longer sharp and angry but distant and unspoken. They moved through the house like strangers sharing a space, their words reduced to polite exchanges about groceries or the weather. Fernanda hated it, but she didn't know how to bridge the growing chasm between them. One morning, she decided to walk into town. The isolation of the house was beginning to suffocate her, and she craved the distraction of people, even if only briefly. Pulling on her thick coat and wrapping a scarf tightly around her neck, she stepped out into the biting wind. The path leading from the house to the road was slick with ice, and she had to tread carefully to avoid slipping. The small town center was quiet, its streets lined with quaint shops and cafes. A few locals milled about, bundled up against the cold, their footsteps crunching on the snow-covered sidewalks. Fernanda wandered aimlessly, peering into the shop windows and trying to ignore the pangs of envy she felt at the simple, unburdened lives these people seemed to lead. She stopped in front of a little market, its display of handmade wreaths and jars of preserves catching her attention. The smell of fresh-baked bread and spiced cider wafted out as she stepped inside, a welcome reprieve from the cold morning. The woman behind the counter greeted her warmly. She was older, with kind eyes and silver hair tucked under a knitted hat. "Cold one today, isn't it?" Fernanda nodded, offering a faint smile. "It is." "Looking for anything special?" the woman asked, arranging a basket of apples on the counter. "No, just browsing," Fernanda replied, her voice hesitant. "Well, take your time. Let me know if you need anything." As she wandered through the store, Fernanda couldn't help but notice how different it felt from the high-end boutiques she used to frequent. There were no polished displays or brand logos here, just simple goods and a quiet sense of community. She picked up a small jar of honey, its label handwritten, and turned it over in her hands. It wasn't much, but it felt oddly comforting. When she brought it to the counter, the woman smiled again. "This one's from a local beekeeper. He's been at it for years, swears it's the best in the state." Fernanda handed over a few crumpled bills, feeling strangely self-conscious. She wasn't used to such personal interactions. Her world had always been one of credit cards and online orders, faceless transactions that required no real connection. "First time in town?" the woman asked as she bagged the honey. "Yes," Fernanda said. "We just moved here." "Well, welcome. It's a quiet place, especially in winter, but it has its charm," the woman said. "If you ever need anything, just stop by." "Thank you," Fernanda said softly, clutching the bag as she left the store. The walk back to the house felt a little less bleak, though the cold still bit at her cheeks and nose. She thought about the woman's kindness, the ease with which she had spoken, and how different it was from the performative conversations Fernanda had grown accustomed to in her old life. It was a small thing, but it stayed with her. When she returned, William was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open and papers spread around him. He barely looked up as she walked in. "I picked up some honey," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "Great," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen. She bit back a sigh, pulling off her coat and scarf. For a moment, she considered telling him about her trip to town, about the woman at the market and the unexpected comfort of that brief exchange. But something stopped her. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea and retreated to the living room. As the days passed, Fernanda found herself seeking out small distractions, rearranging the furniture, organizing the few belongings they had brought with them, even attempting to cook meals from scratch. It wasn't much, but it gave her something to focus on, a way to fill the empty hours. One afternoon, she found an old box tucked away in the closet under the stairs. It was filled with photographs, letters, and other mementos from their early years together. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, she sifted through the contents, her fingers brushing over faded snapshots of a younger, carefree version of herself and William. They had been so different then, full of dreams and plans, unburdened by the weight of wealth and the expectations it brought. She wondered when they had lost that, when their lives had become more about appearances than authenticity. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Fernanda placed one of the photos on the mantel. It was a simple picture of her and William on a beach, their faces lit up with laughter. She didn't say anything when he came downstairs and noticed it, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. The quiet between them shifted slightly after that. It wasn't a dramatic change, there were still long stretches of silence and moments of tension, but there were also small gestures, unspoken attempts to connect. William started joining her in the living room after dinner, sitting with her by the fire even if they didn't talk. For the first time in weeks, Fernanda felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for, the possibility of finding each other again. The mornings in the Hamptons were brisk and quiet, each one starting with a pale light that barely broke through the gray clouds. Fernanda had grown accustomed to waking early, not out of habit but because sleep no longer provided the escape it once had. The weight of everything that had happened lingered, even in her dreams. Yet, this morning felt different. She didn't know why, but as she wrapped herself in her thickest coat and stepped outside, there was something in the air, something that reminded her of how it felt to hope. The snow had begun to melt slightly, leaving the ground slick and patches of grass peeking through. She walked the length of their modest driveway, her breath puffing in small clouds in front of her. A thought crept into her mind, one she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before: maybe this new reality didn't have to be entirely bleak. She didn't fully believe it, but the thought lingered. When she returned inside, William was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. He looked exhausted, as he had for weeks now, but his expression wasn't quite as hardened as it had been before. "I was thinking of heading into town again," Fernanda said, breaking the silence. "Do you need anything?" He glanced up briefly, shaking his head. "No, I'm fine." Fernanda hesitated, waiting for him to ask why she was going or offer to join her. But he didn't. He returned his attention to the screen, his fingers tapping at the keyboard with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of desperation rather than purpose. She sighed softly and grabbed her bag. She didn't expect anything to change overnight, but the growing distance between them gnawed at her in ways she didn't know how to fix. The walk into town was becoming familiar now. The small shops and quiet streets greeted her like an old acquaintance, and she took comfort in the simplicity of it. She stopped by the market first, partly out of necessity and partly to see the friendly woman who ran it. "Back again, I see," the woman said with a smile as Fernanda entered. "Settling in all right?" Fernanda nodded, returning the smile. "Trying to. It's been an adjustment." "I imagine so," the woman said knowingly. She paused, then added, "You know, I've seen a lot of folks come here over the years, looking for a fresh start. Something about this place seems to work its magic. Give it time." Fernanda wasn't sure if she believed that, but the woman's words stayed with her as she left the market and wandered further into town. Her next stop was a small cafe she hadn't noticed before. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries wafted through the air as she stepped inside, the warmth a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The space was cozy, with mismatched furniture and soft music playing in the background. As she waited for her order, she noticed a young woman at a nearby table, carefully arranging handmade ornaments on a small tray. Each one was unique, painted with intricate designs and bright colors. Fernanda couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. "Those are beautiful," she said, surprising herself by speaking up. The woman looked up and smiled. "Thank you. I make them myself. Just a little side project for the holidays." "They're really lovely," Fernanda said, stepping closer. "Do you sell them?" "Yes," the woman replied. "Mostly here and at the local craft fair. It's nothing big, but it keeps me busy." Fernanda studied the ornaments, her fingers brushing lightly over one shaped like a snowflake. There was something so simple and pure about them, something that felt worlds away from the life she had left behind. "I'll take this one," she said, picking up the snowflake. The woman beamed. "Great choice. Let me wrap it for you." As she left the cafe, the ornament carefully tucked into her bag, Fernanda felt an odd sense of accomplishment. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming a part of herself she had forgotten. Back at the house, William was still at the table, his laptop replaced by a stack of papers he was thumbing through with a furrowed brow. Fernanda set the bag from the market on the counter and hesitated, unsure if she should disturb him. "I picked up a few things," she said finally. "And I found something for the house." William glanced up, his expression curious but guarded. "For the house?" She pulled out the ornament and held it up, the painted snowflake catching the faint light. "I thought it might be nice to have something festive, even if it's just this." He stared at it for a moment before a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "It's nice. Where did you find it?" "At a little cafe in town," she said, setting it on the mantel above the fireplace. "A woman there makes them by hand." She was so proud of her work. William nodded, his gaze lingering on the ornament. "It's good. It makes the place feel warmer." The faint warmth of his approval was enough to soften the tension between them, if only slightly. Fernanda took it as a small victory and returned to unpacking the groceries. Over the next few days, the ornament became a quiet symbol of something unspoken between them. William didn't say much about it, but Fernanda noticed him glancing at it now and then, as though it reminded him of something he couldn't quite put into words. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Fernanda decided to take a chance. "There's a craft fair in town this weekend," she said, her voice tentative. "I thought it might be nice to go. Just to get out of the house for a bit." William looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss the idea, but then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The day of the fair, they bundled up against the cold and walked into town together. The fair was set up in the town square, with stalls lining the streets and twinkling lights strung overhead. The air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider, and the sound of carolers drifted through the crowd. Fernanda felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: joy. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, nestled between the laughter of children and the warmth of the holiday spirit. William seemed lighter too, though he didn't say much. He followed her from stall to stall, occasionally stopping to admire the handmade goods or taste a sample of something warm and spiced. At one stall, Fernanda found a set of hand-painted mugs that matched the ornament she had bought. She turned to William, holding them up with a small smile. "What do you think?" she asked. That he studied them for a moment before nodding. "I think they're perfect." It wasn't much, a quiet day, a simple fare, but for the first time since their world had fallen apart, Fernanda felt like they were finding pieces of themselves again. And that, she thought, was more than enough to build on. The last day of the year dawned gray and cold, the kind of winter morning that seemed to stretch endlessly into itself. The frost on the windows of the small house blurred the view of the world outside, a fitting reflection of the tension still lingering within. Fernanda sat at the kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm coffee in her hands. She stared into it, as though the swirling dark liquid held the answers to all the questions that had haunted her for weeks. William was upstairs in the study again, his presence barely registering as part of the home anymore. He spent most of his time in that cramped space, either working on emails or pretending to. Fernanda suspected he was simply hiding from everything, including her. The silence between them had grown colder, like the frost spreading along the edges of the windows. They had mastered the art of avoidance, their interactions reduced to logistical exchanges: what time the heating needed to be checked, when the snow on the driveway should be cleared. Neither spoke of what they had lost, nor did they dare to address the growing chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. By midday, the snow had stopped falling, leaving a thin, crunchy layer on the ground. The sky was overcast, a pale blanket of gray that stretched from horizon to horizon. Fernanda pulled on her coat and scarf, grabbing her gloves from the counter. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. "I'm going for a walk," she called out, her voice loud enough to carry. There was no immediate response. After a moment, she heard his voice, muffled and distant. "All right." She stepped outside, her boots crunching in the snow as she headed down the familiar path toward the beach. The air was sharp and bracing, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved quickly in the breeze. the beach stretched before her, vast and empty, the sand damp and dark from the melting snow. The waves rolled in, their rhythmic crash the only sound in the stillness. Fernanda walked along the shoreline, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets, her head down against the cold wind. The ocean had always unsettled her in the winter. There was something haunting about its endless expanse, its raw power, stripped of the warmth and joy it offered in summer. It reminded her of how vulnerable everything truly was, how easily things could be lost. She didn't hear William approach at first, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the wind and the waves. It wasn't until he called her name, his voice cutting through the cold air, that she turned. That he stood a few feet away, his coat buttoned tightly and his hands shoved into his pockets. His expression was unreadable, a mix of exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite place. "I thought I'd join you," he said simply, stepping closer. She nodded, and they began walking together in silence. For a long time, neither spoke. They walked side by side, their footsteps forming a trail along the damp sand. The waves continued their relentless rhythm, crashing and retreating, crashing and retreating. "I used to love the beach in winter," William said suddenly, his voice soft. It felt quieter, calmer, like the world was holding its breath. Fernanda glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected vulnerability in his tone. "I don't think I've ever liked it," she admitted. "It always felt lonely." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It does, doesn't it?" The silence returned, but this time it felt different, less heavy, more contemplative. After a while, they stopped walking. William knelt to pick up a small piece of driftwood, turning it over in his hands. "Do you remember that trip we took to Cape Cod?" he asked, still looking at the wood. Fernanda frowned, the memory stirring faintly. "The one where it rained the entire time?" He smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah. We spent most of the week in that little bed and breakfast, reading and playing cards. I think that was the last time we went somewhere without an agenda, without worrying about how it looked to anyone else." She hesitated, the memory blooming more vividly now. It had been years ago, before the houses and the cars and the parties. They had been newly married, still figuring out what kind of life they wanted to build together. "I remember," she said quietly. William tossed the driftwood back onto the sand and turned to face her. "Do you ever think about those days? Before all of this?" Fernanda looked at him, the question catching her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it feels so far away. Like it was another life." "It does," he agreed. "But I've been thinking, maybe it doesn't have to be." She stared at him, unsure of what he meant. "I mean," he continued, his voice faltering slightly, "maybe we don't need to keep trying to get back to what we had before. The money, the lifestyle, all of it. Maybe we can start over. Build something simpler. Something real." His words hung in the air, carried away by the wind before they could fully settle. Fernanda looked down at the sand, her thoughts racing. She wanted to believe him, to believe that they could find a way to move forward. But the fear of losing even more than they already had was paralyzing. "I don't know if I can," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. William stepped closer, his hand reaching out to hers. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she let him take it. His grip was warm, steady, grounding. "We've been through worse," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And we got through it because we had each other. That's what I've been holding on to, Fernanda. Not the money, not the life we built. Just us." She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt something crack open inside her, something that had been locked away beneath layers of anger and resentment and fear. "Us," she repeated, the word feeling foreign but comforting. That he nodded, his eyes searching hers. "We can do this. Together." The sound of the waves filled the space between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Fernanda believed him. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the sky in muted shades of orange and gray, they turned and began walking back toward the house. Their footsteps on the sand soon disappeared beneath the tide, leaving no trace of where they had been. But something had shifted between them, something that felt fragile but real, a step toward the possibility of healing. The new year was hours away, and for the first time in a long time, Fernanda felt a glimmer of hope. The small house seemed quieter than usual that evening. The muted glow of the fire flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that danced in rhythm with its crackling. Fernanda sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by old boxes she had retrieved from the closet beneath the stairs. The air was thick with the musty scent of cardboard and forgotten memories. She hadn't planned to spend her evening rummaging through these relics of their past, but earlier that day, as she cleaned out the narrow hallway closet, she had stumbled upon a box marked in faded ink, "Memories." The label, written in William's handwriting, had stopped her in her tracks. It had been so long since she'd seen anything handwritten by him, let alone something so personal. Pulling the box out, she carried it to the living room, unsure of what she hoped to find. Now, hours later, she was surrounded by a mess of photographs, postcards, and mementos from a life she barely recognized. A photo caught her attention, a younger version of herself and William, arms wrapped around each other, smiling wide for the camera. They stood in front of an old bookstore in Paris, their faces flushed from the cold and the wine they'd been drinking that day. She ran her thumb over the glossy surface, her chest tightening as the memory resurfaced. They had been so different then, so full of dreams and plans. They hadn't yet tasted the pressures of wealth or the relentless expectations that came with it. Back then, it was just the two of them against the world. "Find anything interesting?" William's voice startled her, and she looked up to see him leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He looked tired, but there was a softness in his expression that she hadn't seen in weeks. "I didn't mean to dig through your things," she said, holding up the photo. "I found this while I was cleaning." He walked over and took the photo from her, his lips curving into a faint smile as he studied it. "Paris," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "That was a good trip." "It was," Fernanda agreed. "I'd forgotten about that bookstore." "You spent hours in there." William chuckled, setting the photo on the coffee table. "I think I bought more books than I could carry. You kept laughing at me the whole way back to the hotel." She smiled, the memory warming her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "We were happy then," she said softly. He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, his gaze fell to the open box at her feet. "What else did you find?" Fernanda reached into the box, pulling out a small stack of letters tied together with a fraying ribbon. She held them up, her brows furrowing. "What are these?" William's face shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. "Oh," he said quietly. "I didn't think I still had those." Curiosity piqued, Fernanda untied the ribbon and sifted through the letters. Most were addressed to her in William's handwriting, though she didn't recognize them. "You wrote these to me?" He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I never got around to giving them to you." "Why not?" He hesitated, sitting down across from her. "I don't know," he admitted. "At first, I wrote them when we were dating, just little notes about how I felt. But I wasn't sure how you'd react, so I kept them. And then, well, life got busy, I guess." Fernanda carefully unfolded the top letter, the paper worn but the ink still crisp. "Dear Fernanda, today, you smiled at me in that way only you can, and it made me forget everything else. I don't think I've ever been more certain about anything in my life than I am about us. You make me believe in things I didn't think were possible, like love that doesn't fade, dreams that don't feel too big, and a future that doesn't scare me. I can't wait to see where we go from here. Wherever it is, as long as you're there, it'll be home, always." William, the words hit her like a wave, the raw sincerity of them cutting through the layers of bitterness and resentment that had built up between them. She read it again, her fingers trembling slightly as she folded it back up. "You wrote this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. William nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I meant every word." Fernanda placed the letter carefully on the table, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me you felt this way? Back then, I mean." He shrugged, his gaze distant. I thought I had. Maybe not in words, but in other ways. But somewhere along the line, I stopped trying. We both did, I think. She looked at him, the vulnerability in his face making her chest ache. For so long, she had been angry at him, at their situation, at herself. But sitting here, surrounded by fragments of their past, she realized how much they had both lost along the way. Not just money or status, but each other. I think I forgot, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Forgot what? How much we used to care about each other. Before everything else got in the way. William leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. We can't change the past, he said. But maybe we can remember it. And maybe that's enough to figure out where we go from here. She nodded slowly, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for, a chance to rebuild. As the fire burned low, Fernanda tucked the letters back into their ribbon and placed them carefully in the box. She would read the rest later, she decided, one letter at a time, savoring each word as a reminder of who they had once been. When she looked up, William was watching her, a small, tentative smile on his face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I think we've still got a bottle of wine in the kitchen, he said. Do you want to open it? Fernanda laughed softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Why not? They spent the rest of the evening talking, their voices filling the quiet house as the fire crackled in the hearth. It wasn't the glamorous New Year's Eve they might have once envisioned, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it was enough. And as the clock struck midnight, they clinked their glasses together, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the possibility of a new beginning. The first days of the new year arrived quietly, marked by the same stillness that had defined their life in the Hamptons. But something about the air inside the small house had shifted. It wasn't immediately visible, there were still silences, still cautious exchanges, but there was a sense of something unspoken between Fernanda and William, a fragile understanding that hadn't been there before. Fernanda woke early that morning, slipping out of bed while William still slept. The house was cold, and she wrapped herself in a thick sweater as she padded down the stairs. The kitchen was bathed in a pale, gray light that filtered through the frosted windows. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table, her fingers curling around the warm mug. On the table before her was a notebook, its blank pages staring back at her. She had taken it out the night before, inspired by the faint glimmer of hope that had begun to grow during their walk on the beach. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of starting over, not just as individuals, but as a couple. When William finally came downstairs, his hair tousled and his face still marked by sleep, she greeted him with a quiet smile. "Morning," she said, sliding a mug of coffee across the table to him. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough. He took a seat across from her, glancing at the notebook. "What's that?" "I was thinking," she began, hesitating as she searched for the right words. "Maybe it's time we started planning what comes next." William raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" She flipped the notebook open, revealing the few words she had scribbled the night before. "I mean, we've spent weeks, months, really, trying to make sense of what happened. But we haven't actually talked about what we're going to do now. Where we go from here." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers wrapping around his coffee mug. "That's because I don't know if there's a clear answer to that," he admitted. "There might not be," she said, her voice steady. "But we have to start somewhere, don't we?" William studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Where do we start?" Fernanda took a deep breath, flipping to a fresh page in the notebook. "Well, for starters, we need to figure out how we're going to support ourselves. What kind of work we can do." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think anyone's hiring former millionaire socialites right now." "That's not what I meant," she said, rolling her eyes. "We both have skills, William. You're brilliant with finance, maybe you could do consulting. And I could. I don't know." Figure something out. Something that feels meaningful. He frowned, tapping his fingers against the edge of his mug. Consulting isn't a bad idea, he said slowly. But it's going to take time to build up a client base. And it's not exactly going to pay off immediately. We're not looking for immediate fixes, she reminded him. We're looking for a fresh start. Something sustainable. William nodded, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. You're serious about this, aren't you? I am, she said firmly. We've spent so much time feeling sorry for ourselves, and I'm tired of it. I want to do something. Build something. Her determination seemed to spark something in him, and he leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. All right, he said again. Let's start small. I'll look into consulting work. Maybe even offer free advice to get my name out there again. And I've been thinking about that craft fair we went to, she said. There was something about those handmade goods, the way people poured themselves into their work. I want to try something like that. William's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Crafts? Not exactly, she said, laughing softly. But I've always loved design. Maybe I could create something, home goods, decor, I don't know. I could start small, sell online. That's actually a really good idea, he said, his tone warm. They spent the rest of the morning talking, their ideas spilling out onto the pages of the notebook. William sketched out a rough plan for his consulting work, noting potential contacts and strategies. Fernanda brainstormed ideas for her business, envisioning a line of simple, elegant pieces that felt personal and accessible. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of purpose, a shared goal that brought them closer together. By the time afternoon arrived, the house was filled with the sounds of movement. William set up a makeshift workspace in the study, organizing his notes and drafting emails to old colleagues. Fernanda cleared a corner of the living room, where she began experimenting with designs and gathering materials from around the house. They worked separately but in harmony, their shared energy infusing the space with a quiet optimism. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Fernanda placed the notebook on the table between them. I think we're onto something, she said, her voice soft but confident. William nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I think so too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of the fire filling the space. Then William reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. We're going to be okay, he said quietly. Fernanda looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. I believe you, she said. As the fire burned low and the room grew darker, they held on to each other, the weight of the past beginning to lift. The plans they had made were small steps, but they were steps forward, and that was all that mattered. The new year stretched out before them, uncertain but filled with possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were ready to face it together. The night was still as the final hours of the year ticked away. Outside the small house in the Hamptons, the snow glistened under the faint moonlight, and the air was sharp with cold. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the living room. Fernanda sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs and a glass of wine in her hand. The notebook they had started earlier lay on the coffee table, its pages filled with tentative plans for the future. William was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink. He moved more slowly than usual, his steps deliberate as though he were processing something unspoken. When he returned to the living room, he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and the occasional pop of a log shifting in the flames. Hard to believe it's New Year's Eve, Fernanda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. William nodded, taking a sip of his drink. Feels different this year, he said. Everything feels different, she replied, her gaze fixed on the fire. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. The weight of the past year pressed heavily on them, but there was also something else, something lighter, more hopeful. It was fragile, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground, but it was there. I was thinking, William said suddenly, breaking the silence. We should do something to mark the new year. Something meaningful. Fernanda looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. Like what? I don't know, he admitted, setting his glass on the table. But it feels like we should. After everything that's happened, after all the mistakes we've made. I don't want to carry that into the new year. She considered his words, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. Maybe it doesn't have to be anything big, she said slowly. Maybe it's just, letting go. Of the anger, the resentment, all the things we've been holding on to. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I like that, he said. But how do we do it? Fernanda thought for a moment, then stood and walked over to the small desk by the window. She opened a drawer and pulled out 2 sheets of paper and a pen. Returning to the couch, she handed one to William and kept the other for herself. Write it down, she said, sitting back down beside him. Everything you want to leave behind. The things that have been weighing you down. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the pen. Fernanda did the same, and for the next several minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint scratch of pen on paper. When she finished, she set the pen down and folded the paper in half. She glanced at William, who was still writing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he set his paper on the table and leaned back with a deep exhale. What now? He asked, looking at her. Fernanda stood again, this time retrieving a small metal tray from the kitchen. She placed it on the coffee table and picked up the folded pieces of paper. Now we burn them, she said simply. William raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. He watched as Fernanda carefully placed the papers on the tray and carried it to the fireplace. Kneeling by the hearth, she picked up the fireplace tongs and fed the papers into the flames one by one. The fire crackled and flared as the papers caught, curling and blackening until they disintegrated entirely. For a moment, Fernanda stared into the flames, feeling an odd sense of release. When she turned back to William, he was watching her with a small, thoughtful smile. That felt good, he said. It did, she agreed. Returning to the couch, they sat quietly again, the weight in the room feeling noticeably lighter. Outside, the faint sound of fireworks began to echo in the distance, muffled by the winter air. William reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers. You know, he said, his voice soft, I don't think I've ever felt more hopeful about a new year. Fernanda smiled, her chest tightening with a mix of emotion. Me too, she said. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, they moved to the window, their glasses in hand. The fireworks were faint but visible in the distance, bursts of color lighting up the dark sky. They stood side by side, their shoulders touching, watching the display in silence. When the clock struck midnight, William turned to her, his expression serious but warm. Happy New Year, he said, his voice steady. Happy New Year, she replied, raising her glass to his. They clinked their glasses together, the sound crisp and clear in the quiet room. To us, William said, his voice filled with quiet determination. To us, Fernanda echoed, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and gratitude. The fireworks continued to light up the sky, their reflection shimmering faintly in the frosted window. For the first time in what felt like forever, Fernanda felt at peace. The challenges ahead were still daunting, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them. With William by her side. As they stood there, watching the fireworks fade into the night, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady. It blanketed the ground in a fresh layer of white, a clean slate to mark the beginning of a new year. And as Fernanda leaned into William's embrace, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the quiet certainty that, together, they could rebuild. One step at a time. The first week of the new year brought a quiet determination to the little house in the Hamptons. The heaviness that had lingered for so long had begun to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. The resolutions made on New Year's Eve weren't just words, they were promises, fragile but resolute, and both Fernanda and William seemed intent on honoring them. Fernanda started her mornings with purpose. She cleared a small space in the corner of the living room and began setting up a makeshift workstation. It wasn't much, just an old desk they had salvaged from the garage and a chair that creaked when she sat in it, but it was hers. She spent hours sketching ideas for her business, pulling inspiration from the craft fair they'd visited and the handmade ornament she'd bought. Her designs were simple but elegant, hand-painted vases, decorative trays, and minimalist candle holders. She envisioned them as pieces that could bring warmth and beauty to any home, no matter how modest. It was a stark contrast to the opulent, impersonal decor she had once surrounded herself with, and the thought of creating something meaningful filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One morning, she found William standing behind her, watching as she carefully painted delicate floral patterns onto a ceramic vase. "That looks amazing," he said, his tone genuinely admiring. She looked up at him, surprised but pleased. "Thanks," she said. "It's not much, but it feels good to be doing something with my hands." He nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "It's more than not much. You've got real talent, Fernanda." His words warmed her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe them. William, too, had thrown himself into his work. The study had become his domain, filled with stacks of papers, a second-hand desk lamp, and the steady hum of his laptop. He was reaching out to old colleagues, offering his expertise in financial planning and damage control. His first few emails had gone unanswered, but eventually, replies began to trickle in. One afternoon, he came into the kitchen with a faint smile on his face. "I just got my first client," he announced, holding up his phone. Fernanda looked up from the bowl of dough she was kneading. "That's amazing," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "It's nothing big," he admitted. "Just a small business owner who needs help organizing their accounts. But it's a start." "A start is all we need," she said, her smile genuine. Their days settled into a quiet rhythm. In the mornings, they worked separately, Fernanda in the living room, William in the study. In the afternoons, they came together for lunch, sharing small victories and brainstorming ideas. Evenings were spent by the fire, reviewing their progress and planning for the days ahead. For the first time in months, the house felt less like a prison and more like a home. One evening, as they sat on the couch with a shared blanket draped over their laps, Fernanda showed William her sketches for a small online shop. "I've been thinking about names," she said, flipping through her notebook. "Something simple but meaningful. What do you think of Haven Designs?" William tilted his head, considering. "I like it," he said. "It feels safe. Like what we're trying to build here." "That's exactly what I was going for," she said, her face lighting up. He nodded, his hand brushing hers. "It's perfect." Fernanda's first attempt at selling her creations wasn't without its challenges. She spent hours researching how to set up an online store, watching tutorials and reading guides. The process was more complicated than she'd expected, but she refused to give up. By mid-January, she had launched her shop with a modest inventory of vases, trays, and small paintings. To her surprise, her first order came within days. A woman from Boston who had stumbled upon the shop while browsing for handmade decor. "You sold something?" William asked that evening, his face breaking into a grin when she told him the news. "I did," she said, laughing. "I don't even know how she found me, but she bought a vase." "That's incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You're officially a businesswoman." The sense of accomplishment was exhilarating, and it spurred her to keep going. William's consulting work also began to gain traction. His initial client referred him to a friend, and soon he found himself juggling multiple projects. The work was slow and often tedious, but it was honest, and he took pride in helping small businesses find stability in uncertain times. One night, as they sat together by the fire, Fernanda asked him, "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" he replied, looking up from the document he'd been reviewing. "The old life," she said. "The parties, the travel, the everything." He thought for a moment before shaking his head. "Not really," he said. "I thought I would, but I don't. That life, it wasn't real. It felt like we were always chasing something, but I'm not sure we ever knew what." Fernanda nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I think I missed the idea of it," she admitted. "But not the reality. It was exhausting, wasn't it?" "It was," he agreed. "And it wasn't us." "Not really. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "I like this better," she said softly. "Me too," he said, his voice steadied. As the weeks went on, their small successes began to add up. Fernanda's shop received more orders, and she started receiving messages from customers who loved her work. William's consulting business grew steadily, and he even began to consider hiring an assistant to help with the workload. The house, once a symbol of their loss, had become a sanctuary, a place where they could rebuild, piece by piece. One Saturday morning, Fernanda stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as sunlight streamed through the windows. William came in, carrying a small package he had retrieved from the mailbox. "This came for you," he said, handing it to her. She opened it to find a handwritten note from one of her customers, thanking her for the beautiful vase she had ordered and including a photo of it on her dining table. Fernanda smiled, her eyes misting slightly. "It's not much," she said, holding up the note. "But it feels like everything." William placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression warm. "That's because it is," he said. As they sat down to breakfast, the world outside their little house felt far away. The challenges they faced were still real, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Together, they had found a way to move forward, not by chasing the life they had lost, but by building something new. And as they clinked their coffee mugs together in a quiet toast, Fernanda knew that this was only the beginning. The days in the Hamptons grew brighter as winter began its slow retreat. The snow that had once blanketed everything in silence melted into patches of damp earth, and the air softened, carrying hints of salt and seaweed from the nearby ocean. For the first time in what felt like forever, life inside the little house no longer felt like something they were enduring. It felt like something they were living. Fernanda sat in her corner of the living room, the space now transformed into a vibrant workshop. The desk was cluttered with paintbrushes, jars of color, and half-finished projects. Her latest creation, a set of hand-painted ceramic bowls, sat drying in the soft morning light. As she worked, she could hear William in the study, his voice rising and falling in conversation with a client. It had become a familiar background rhythm in their home, a sound that no longer carried the tension and desperation it once had. He was thriving in his new role, his consulting work growing steadily. Fernanda leaned back in her chair, wiping a streak of paint from her cheek. She looked around the room, her gaze falling on the little ornament she had bought at the craft fair weeks ago. It still hung from a nail above the mantel, a quiet reminder of where this new chapter had begun. The sound of William's footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. He appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and smiling in a way that lit up his entire face. "Guess what?" he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "What?" she asked, setting down her brush. "I just signed my biggest client yet," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a mid-sized firm looking to reorganize their finances. It's going to be a lot of work, but if this goes well, it could open up even more opportunities." Fernanda's face broke into a grin. "William, that's amazing." He shrugged modestly but couldn't hide the pride in his eyes. "It feels good," he admitted. "To be doing something honest. Something that actually helps people." "It suits you," she said warmly. He crossed the room to stand beside her desk, his gaze falling on the bowls she had been working on. "These are beautiful," he said, picking one up carefully. "Thanks," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm thinking of adding them to the shop next week." "You should," he said, setting the bowl back down. "You've got a real talent, Fernanda. People love what you're doing." His encouragement made her heart swell. For so long, she had doubted herself, questioning whether she could ever create something meaningful. But the steady stream of positive reviews and repeat customers had begun to chip away at those doubts, and William's unwavering support only strengthened her resolve. Later that evening, they decided to take a walk on the beach. The tide was low, exposing stretches of damp sand scattered with shells and bits of driftwood. The air was still cold, but there was a freshness to it that hinted at the coming spring. They walked side by side, their steps unhurried. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy or strained, it was comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding that had grown between them over the past months. As they reached a spot where the waves lapped gently at the shore, William stopped and turned to face her. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his tone serious but warm. Fernanda raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh. What's that?" "I think we should stay here," he said, gesturing to the beach and the horizon beyond. "Not just for now, but for good. I know this place wasn't what we wanted when we first came here, but it feels like home, doesn't it?" She looked around, taking in the vast expanse of the ocean, the simplicity of the landscape, and the sense of peace that had settled over her since they'd arrived. "It does," she admitted. "But are you sure? What about everything we left behind?" William smiled faintly. "I don't want to go back to that life, Fernanda. I don't miss it. This, what we've built here, it feels real. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually living." His words resonated deeply with her. She had been so focused on rebuilding her own sense of purpose that she hadn't fully realized how much this place had become a part of her. The thought of leaving it, of returning to the chaos and superficiality of their old life, felt impossible. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's stay." William's smile widened, and he took her hands in his. "We'll make this our home," he said. "For real this time." They continued walking as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The sound of the waves was soothing, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the newfound harmony in their lives. When they returned to the house, Fernanda lit a candle on the dining table, its warm glow filling the room. They shared a simple dinner, laughing and talking as though the weight of the past year had finally lifted. Afterward, they sat by the fire, their hands entwined. "I don't know what the future holds," Fernanda said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Neither do I," William replied. "But I know we'll face it together." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "We will," she said. As the fire burned low and the room grew darker, the snow began to fall again outside. It coated the ground in a fresh layer of white, erasing the footprints they had left on their way to the beach. It was a fitting symbol, Fernanda thought, of the clean slate they had been given, a chance to start over, not just as individuals but as partners, rebuilding their lives on a foundation of honesty, love, and hope. And as she leaned into William's embrace, the sound of the waves faintly audible in the distance, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, steady joy that came from knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.